Chapter 5 The Department of Childhood Memories. Delwyn decided to make her way back to the cafe, wondering if she should apologise since Gwen had been kind enough to take her in after all that had transpired. As she walked past the cars, the rain lighter now, her aunt flashed the high beams at her to let her know her whereabouts. She felt foolish, but she went to the car and let herself in, and before she could blurt out an apology, Gwen beat her to it. "Delwyn, forgive an old biddy for being a treacle-beak." They laughed and leaned towards each other gratefully, Gwen throwing her arms around Delwyn's damp shoulders. "Only if you forgive a nut-job for being childish," Delwyn replied, snuggling into Gwen's arm and green cardigan, feeling the sudden need for motherly comfort. Her aunt became serious and almost like a sage. "Don't ever say that about yourself, love. You've got a lot to deal with, and you had a lot to deal with growing up. It's no wonder you run and hide all the time, but it's time to venture out of the rabbit hole, Del." Delwyn didn't like the words, but played up to them to please Gwen, to appease her and keep the status quo. That was the reason she'd attended the session with Dr. Perdue, and why she'd agreed to start taking the new medication, even though somewhere in the back of her haunted mind she had planned to pretend to take the pills and pretend to absorb the therapy. The mirror and the dream world were at the forefront of her mind. She felt that true recovery could be discovered there, and she needed to make sure that her place at Magpie Meadows was secure for that reason. She hadn't dared to mention the mirror. What if Gwen knew about its secrets and blocked her access? What if she sent her away or sold the mirror, or worse, broke it? These horrible thoughts gave Delwyn a headache, so she pushed them aside and agreed to retell the session for Gwen, jazzing it up to make it seem more agreeable, and painted herself as a willing participant. On the way home, they picked up the prescriptions and discussed their plans for her recovery. It was the first time in a long time that she felt truly secure, notwithstanding her obsession with the mirror. When they arrived home, Gwen handed the 2 pills to Delwyn with a glass of milk and a banana, telling her that the info sheet said not to take them on an empty stomach. She dutifully ate the banana, had a sip of milk, and put one of the pills in her mouth, stashing it down the side of the gum with her tongue. She took another sip of milk and popped the other pill in, pushing it to the other side, and casually sipped more milk as Gwen gathered up the tea towels for the wash. As soon as her back was turned, Delwyn took the pills out and stuffed them into her bra. When her aunt turned back around, Delwyn made a face as though the pills tasted terrible. "Well, go and have a lie down. You've had a big day and they'll kick in soon. Hopefully the side effects won't knock you around too much, sweetie." "Okay, thanks, Auntie Gwen." Delwyn felt bad about the ruse, but quietly righteous. Over the next few weeks, Delwyn did her best to help around the farm. The housework and cooking was easy, and the gathering of the eggs was a no-brainer, although the first time she left the door of the coop open and had to chase all the chickens back in with the help of the dogs. Gwen was not impressed, but she kept silent, as she was obviously happy that at least Delwyn was trying. She did become suspicious when Delwyn kept asking when she was going to go shopping next, especially when she advised that she wasn't interested in accompanying her. "Then what does it matter?" Gwen asked irritably. "Oh, nothing urgent. I just need tampons, that's all." "Well, there are pads in the bathroom cabinet," Gwen said dryly. Delwyn screwed up her nose and said, "I don't like surfboards." "If you're desperate, they'll do. Besides, beggars can't be choosers." "I wasn't aware that I was a beggar," Delwyn said indignantly. Neither of them enjoyed bickering, and it didn't take long before smiles and giggles took over their silly argument. Delwyn realised that it would be easier to wait until night anyway, like the first time after her aunt went to bed. Everything in her life had taken a back seat to the immense importance of the dream world since she discovered it, although She had been deterred by the gnarled hand that grabbed her face and the horrible dream she'd had of Varun threatening her with fiery turtles. All the facets of her everyday life had been reduced to the relevance of a grain of sand in comparison to the massive diamond that the dream world represented, and she was only biding her time until she could slip away and explore it further. She was still waiting for Varun's sign, and it was annoying not to know what it could be or how he would let her know. In that terrible dream he'd said that he'd send her signs, but she was afraid of him now. There was still a piece of her that doubted the whole scenario, the little skeptic or scientist that reminded her that it was most likely another one of her flights of fancies or a hallucination. That and her fear were the only things holding her back, apart from the possibility that she might discover that it was, after all, just a mirror, and that she was still a boring failure trapped in a mundane world. The supposed reality of misfiring synapses, chemical imbalances, frontal lobe anomalies and the like did not sway her desire for escape into an alternate universe where she could discover fascinating things about her inner world, or where she could hide from the real world. She contemplated this, although it made her feel guilty, or perhaps even naughty or silly, as she'd always preferred nonsense and fantasy. She had an addictive personality, whether the vehicle was a substance or otherwise. Delwyn finally decided that, no matter what, it had been the most exciting thing that had ever happened to her, whether real or not, and she wasn't about to try to explain it away or ignore it. She knew that she was supposed to be steering herself away from magical thinking and towards a sane and rational life, a life that would be acceptable to society, which would prevent her from being viewed as a hexagonal peg magnetically opposed to the normal round hole. She remembered a conversation she'd had with Dr. Boyd on being different and trying to live the life of an artist. She understood that until she was published and at least making a living from her writing, that she was the same as any other person needing to keep the ball rolling, paying the bills, and holding down a secure job until the dream came true. Dr. Boyd had asked her why she'd felt that Duncan had failed her when it was obvious that she had failed herself. She'd thought to herself that it was a harsh thing to say after all Delwyn had been through with Duncan, as well as her history with her cold-hearted monster of a mother. Now at a different vantage point, she understood that she was the one who agreed to take part in the marriage and had decided to respond the way that she had. The one thing that Dr. Boyd had said which stood out was, "Why do you think you should be allowed to disappear into a fantasy world when the rest of us have to keep footing the bill and being responsible?" She'd never been able to answer that one apart from the obvious response, to her at least. The alternative is too awful. When Dr. Boyd had asked if reality was such a negative thing, if a life with concrete edges and measurable outcomes was so unpalatable, Delwyn had nodded readily, as though no other answer could be possible. They'd always been at loggerheads. It wasn't as though Delwyn didn't understand psychology, having studied it for many years, being particularly interested in Jung's individuation process. Towards the end, however, it had dawned on her that Dr. Boyd was a lot like her mother, cold and calculating, hard and to the point, even if she was right most of the time. For Dr. Boyd, Delwyn had been an unnecessary mess who hadn't warranted compassion or pity. Not that Delwyn really wanted pity, she just wanted to be understood, then to be left alone. She contemplated her session with Dr. Perdue and how much more thoughtful and open he had been. She knew that he would not allow her to cocoon herself in her daydreams or magical thinking, but he might give her room to explore the issues that plagued her and dissect the warped connective tissue that held together the shattered pieces of her psyche, which was what a good therapist was supposed to do. For a long time she'd turned her back on the idea of therapy, but after that first session she could see the merits of further visits and felt confident that he could help her evolve. Into what, she wasn't sure, but she was sure that she wanted to maintain her secret about the mirror, while at the same time projecting the image of trying her best to attain sanity and normalcy. 1 foot in each world, riding them simultaneously, expecting not to fall. She was writing all these thoughts out in her purple journal, as it was the one she wrote in the most these days. It seemed that almost everything pertained to her magical worlds. Lying on her bed with the curtains open so she could see the lovely trees and lush meadows, she was distracted by Peter pawing at her hand as if to say, "Remember me, don't stop." She continued petting him for a few seconds, but then went out to see what was for dinner. Gwen was sitting at the kitchen table, buttering the bread, obviously not feeling well. "Auntie Gwen, are you sick?" She went over and put her hand on her aunt's shoulder. "Oh, love, just a bloody migraine." She had a few bad migraines every year, especially when it was time to get ready to sell the calves. Delwyn went over to the stove to check the gravy. "Well, I can finish the dinner." "I'm nearly ready, Del, but I don't think I'll be eating. You set the table, love, and if you don't mind eating on your own, I'm going to take my pills and head off to bed." Delwyn went over to her aunt again and started massaging her shoulders. "You sure?" "Yes, love, I'll be okay." Delwyn set the table for one, and Gwen dished up the sausages, mashed potatoes and veggies, but nearly dropped the gravy jug. Delwyn grabbed it from her, set it on the table, and walked her aunt to her bedroom and helped her get undressed and into bed. When she took her pills and lay down, she looked up to see Delwyn's concerned face leaning over her, stroking her forehead. "What a good girl you are." Delwyn smiled and said softly, "I'm very lucky to have you." "And I'm very lucky to have you too, love." "Is there anything else I can get for you?" "No. Go and eat, then take your pills. We'll do the dishes in the morning." Delwyn said okay, leaned over and kissed her on the cheek, and as she walked out of the room it suddenly dawned on her that Gwen was older and that she could lose her one day. A wave of sadness swept over her. What would happen if she lost her? She ate her dinner in sombre silence, trying not to think about sad things, but not being able to help it. Then she saw Peter casually walk out of her room and make his way to the front door, scratching to be let out. Fear and excitement replaced the sadness. She thought about the mirror, and that now was as good a time as any. She wondered if the hand would be waiting for her. She also wondered, again, why Varun had been so mean in her dream, but also, it was actually Varun? Or was it an interpretation of him? She knew a little about Jungian dream work and wondered if he was her animus, her male inner personality, or her representation of how she felt about men. She thought about her father, Greg, Mark, Duncan, and Uncle Sean. She had different feelings towards all of them, and none of them involved fear. Varun was the only one who invoked fear in her. She also wondered why he'd said that he'd sent signs. She couldn't think what they could have been. Maybe it was all part of the dream world and the integration of the self. It was all so complicated, but intriguing at the same time. Delwyn wanted so desperately to figure herself out, to move on and learn how to deal with her issues appropriately. She needed to deal with her deep feelings of guilt, her nightmares, her need for escapism and her hatred for her mother. She felt so overwhelmed by it all, notwithstanding the new feelings she had for Greg, her narcolepsy, and astral travels, growing up and finding her place in the world as well. As she cleaned up, she wondered if she should dare to go to the mirror. She thought hard about Varun and his signs. Maybe the hand coming at her was Varun trying to drag her in. What if she'd waited too long? What if it was already too late and she'd missed her chance and wouldn't be allowed back in again? That did it. She first checked on Gwen, but she was completely passed out. She quietly closed the door and made her way to the front door, where Peter was waiting patiently. She didn't want him to go in case there was going to be danger, but he seemed adamant. The look in his eyes said, "Come on, let's do this." She opened the door and he shot ahead of her. She whispered angrily, "Peter, wait for me, you little bugger." She quickly chased after him, but once she went through the gate and past the bushes, she saw that he'd already rounded the corner. She followed swiftly now, but it was twilight, so she had to double back and grab a flashlight from the windowsill. When she caught up, she saw Peter waiting at the front door of the flat. She flicked the switch of the flashlight and walked up to him, making a face that he ignored. They went in, and this time she closed the door gently behind them. As she turned around and faced towards the room, her heart started the familiar pounding. She didn't need to whisper now, and commanded Peter to wait for her. He did as he was told, which was a small miracle, and they walked slowly together towards the mirror, past the boxes and baskets. She'd forgotten to put the curtain back over it when the hand had grabbed her, and it made her heart skip a beat. She assumed that her aunt didn't come in here, but she couldn't be too sure. At least for now, she could see that there were no clouds in the mirror's surface. She could see Peter's and her own reflection, so everything seemed normal. As she approached, she turned the flashlight away and walked more slowly to prepare for a safe getaway in case something tried to attack her again. But there was no feeling of foreboding like the last time. It was neutral, and seeing as Peter wasn't fussed, she felt brave enough to get closer. She looked down at Peter and said, "Well, what are you waiting for?" He looked up at her, sitting still as though he wanted her to go first. This made her a little nervous. "You want me to go first?" she asked. He looked at the mirror, then back at her without a sound. She took a deep breath, grabbed the frame with her left hand and put her right foot in. The sensation that started in her foot was different to the first time she went in. It was more like stepping into a bath of Epsom salts or soda water. It tickled and was quite pleasant, which made her smile. She looked down at Peter, who was inspired by her positive vibes, and stuck his head into the mirror. At once she saw his tail stand up straight, then he disappeared in a flash. She stepped right in, but couldn't see a thing, as it was like looking through a kaleidoscope of multicoloured crystals. For a moment she felt woozy and had difficulty getting her bearings, already forgetting to keep a hold on the frame of the mirror. Now she was standing on the other side, feeling like she was immersed in a gigantic bottle of soda, her cells buzzing warmly and her eyes trying to adjust to the moving flashes of jewelled orbs. She called out for Peter, and like the first time, her voice was warped, but sounding like someone rubbing the rims of wine glasses with a wet finger. "Peter!" she called in a sing-song crystal voice. She didn't hear him respond, so she called again, louder. "Peter!" This time the ringing echoed like several wet fingers on several wine glasses at different pitches. Still no response. She looked around and was starting to feel nauseous with the sounds and flashing colours. It was almost like continuous inertia and vertigo involving all the senses. She yelled louder, one more time, "Peter!" It was a crescendo of 1,000 crystal rings, so deafening that it almost burst her eardrums. The reverberations and echoes created visual patterns in the kaleidoscope of colour, so the atmosphere suddenly shattered into a billion pieces, like millions of windows breaking at once. Delwyn ducked down and hid her head in her arms, rolling herself into a ball, fearing that she would be cut by the falling pieces of glass. Then silence. It was almost as loud as the crescendo. It took a while for Delwyn to realise that there was no glass. She slowly looked up and saw that she was blanketed in darkness. Too afraid to call for Peter again, she stood up and looked around in all directions. She could see that she was in a very long black hallway, but there were no doors. Moving forward, she walked quickly, hoping to come across some kind of entrance or portal, but it was endless. There was no sound. Her footfalls were as though muted by black cotton wool. She stopped and bent down to touch the floor. It felt like warm rubber and was spongy to the touch. When she stood up, she noticed that if she didn't keep moving, she started sinking into the floor. Her feet were being sucked into the rubber. She squealed, but the sound was like cotton wool stuffed down her throat. She tried to say something as she started scrambling along the hallway, but the sound continued coming out muted and soft. She jerked her head this way and that, searching for doors or windows, but the hallway stretched on. Running now, panic setting in, she started mentally kicking herself for wishing herself into the dream world, especially if it was going to be like this. Right as she began to lose hope, a sharp bend appeared to the left. She turned into it, relieved that something had changed. Again, she kept running for a long time until she ran out of breath and stopped for a rest, but noticed that her feet still sunk into the black rubber if she stood for too long. Squealing her cotton squeal, she took off and saw another detour, this time to the right, and it wasn't long before she saw a door in the wall, black like the rest of the dark hallways. She was lucky as she nearly zoomed right past it. She walked up to it and quickly reached out to grab the handle, but fear gripped her and froze her to the spot. What if there was something awful behind the door? It turned out that she didn't have time to think as her feet started sinking again. The handle to the door was also black rubber, and as she tried to turn it, she felt it bend and warp out of her grip. Screaming and choking with the cotton sound, she jiggled the handle ferociously, looking down to see her feet, now nearly 2 inches deep in the floor. With one last shove, the door flew open and she tumbled in, but without her shoes. As she rolled to a stop, she realized that she was in a giant baby's crib. She looked around and saw that the room was familiar. It was night, and she walked over to the bars of the wooden crib that seemed more like huge trees all lined up in a neat forest. The blankets were like a soft meadow, and she crept over them, not sure of what was happening. Then she saw her beloved teddy bear from when she was a child, huge now, propped up against the headboard. She felt warm and cozy and started running to him, happy to remember that this was her room from a long time ago, but before she could get to him, she heard giggling and felt the crib shake like an earthquake. The giggling was familiar, and as she dropped down behind one of the folds in the blanket, she saw a huge, plump hand grasp one of the bars from the outside. Her heart started pumping furiously as another hand reached up and grabbed a bar. The shaking of the crib became more intensified. Then her heart nearly stopped when she saw the face rise up between the chubby hands, grinning and giggling with some kind of little box in its teeth. Delwyn remembered in her horror that the face was hers as a child. All she could do was stay crouching and watch the girl, herself, climb over the top of the crib, giggling maniacally, the voice loud and booming as she drooled over the box in her mouth, and then dropped heavily onto the mattress. Delwyn was thrown up in the air with the impact and landed 10 feet away, screaming audibly this time, but the giggling version of herself didn't notice. Delwyn knew what was going to happen next, and she ran back to where she came from, but could not find the door. She spun around when she felt the shaking stop, and realized that the giggling had ceased. The girl was concentrating, with a frown on her chubby face, as she opened the little box and took out a match. Delwyn yelled, "No, please don't!" The girl was clumsy and uncoordinated, striking like a drunk with no luck at first. Delwyn raced back and forth trying to find the wretched door, but to no avail. Then she heard the first strike of the match, and without turning around, she saw the flare of the yellow light on the wall as the flames leapt from the edge of the crib. She backed against the wall and screamed, "No, don't!" But the girl was getting better at it, striking again and again, giggling ferociously, and throwing each lit match to the edges and far corners of the crib. The teddy's leg had caught fire, and Delwyn remembered the scene from when she was the toddler, watching the flames in rapture, feeling like she was sitting in the middle of a big birthday cake. She remembered that her mother had heard the screaming and called the fire brigade. She also remembered seeing them crashing into the room to save her. The nightdress had gone up in smoke, and all that had been left were the arms and the back of it. She hadn't suffered any burns whatsoever. Everyone had thought that it was a miracle. Her teddy had a burnt leg, and she'd been completely grief-stricken about that. Every time she looked at him, she'd been racked with guilt for having hurt him so much. Even as a young adult, she'd felt a twinge of shame, and it took a long time for her to realise that he was just an inanimate object. But this was the dream world, and Delwyn didn't know what was supposed to happen. The flames were everywhere, and the girl kept laughing and throwing matches. Delwyn screamed for Varun, and in a blaze of purple fire and a loud hiss, he appeared.
Well, what a dangerous little girl you were.
He was red all over, his eyes gleaming yellow, and he was laughing as though it was a huge joke. "What in the hell is so fucking funny? Get me out of here!" she yelled. He cocked his head and raised an eyebrow at her.
"What's the magic word?"
"Now!" Her blood was pumping with fury as the flames were closing in. Varun clicked his fingers, and in an instant they were back in the black hallway. Delwyn looked around, and once again her feet started sinking. She looked up at Varun, who was now all black, floating and looking at her with total amusement. She tried to complain about her feet sinking, but the cotton wool voice came back. He laughed and clasped his hands together like someone watching an amusing TV show.
"Oh, I see you're not having any fun, my dear. But you so wanted to come back, didn't you?"
Her feet continued sinking, and she reached out and grabbed his arm suddenly, shocking him with her anger.
All right, just this once."
He snapped his fingers, and she was back on solid ground, able to speak properly. "What is going on here? This is horrible," she complained, fingers digging into his fishy flesh. He disappeared in a puff of black smoke, and then reappeared behind her, tapping her on the shoulder playfully. She jerked herself around and tried to slap him, but he was too quick, darting out of the way.
Now, you must learn to control yourself."
He was so pleased with himself, which annoyed her immensely. "Tell me what's going on," she demanded. He sighed at her impudence.
"You do know where you are, don't you, Delwyn? This is the dream world, is it not?"
She saw ripples of dark rainbows running up and down his black scales, which temporarily distracted her. "I know it's the dream world, but why did I have to go through that again?"
"Lessons, of course. You know all about the symbolism. Use your brain, woman. You're so smart."
Almost in tears, she pleaded like a child. "I don't want to go through my childhood again, Varun." His eyes darkened even further.
"But that's where it all began, my child. Pay attention. This is important. I can't save you all the time. I have other charges."
"But I don't think I can do this. I'm too scared. I didn't expect—" She trailed off, as she didn't want to give away that she really just wanted to have fun exploring. Varun floated higher still and looked down at her, the hissing starting again.
"University, yes. Playground, no."
Delwyn straightened up and said, I know, but can you at least help me? Just a little?" He sighed and came back down to her level.
"Very well, but remember, you are here in physical form. I cannot guarantee that you will not be hurt physically, and spiritual pain is worse. If you learn, and learn you must, and seek to learn, my girl, then I will help you, if I deem you worthy. But if you waste time here, you are on your own."
"Okay, is that it?" she said, deflated.
"It's more than others get,"
he snapped, and vanished in a tiny black tornado. Then Delwyn remembered the dream and yelled out, "Wait, I have to ask you something else." Varun didn't respond, and she realised that she would have to wait until she saw him next time. She looked up and down the black hallway with no idea which way to go. At least her feet weren't sinking anymore. She tried speaking again and found that she still had her normal voice. She remembered Peter and called for him, but he didn't respond either. She thought about what Varun had said about learning and not using the dream world as a playground. Rules everywhere. Even here she couldn't escape responsibility. She also remembered that he seemed to be able to read her mind, so she felt even more constricted. But after all was said and done, she was interested in sorting out her crap, and she had always been fascinated with dreams, and this was a great opportunity. It was time to be positive and put her knowledge of symbolism to work. As soon as she thought this, a black desk appeared down the hallway with a nice black leather chair in front of it. She walked towards it in her socks, as her shoes had already been absorbed by the floor. When she got to the desk, she saw a huge journal open up with a lovely silver pen resting on it. At first she thought, "How daft, I can't bring this back with me." But then she realised that just writing down the dreams and symbols would solidify them in her memory, and she could record them again in the real world. She sat down on the comfortable chair and picked up the fine pen, then smoothed the creamy pages of the journal with her hand. She started writing about the crib, the fire, and her teddy bear. Immediately her brain got to work, throwing up explanations of the symbols. She remembered that, as a child, she was left to her own devices, as her mother did only the barest of essentials to keep her alive. That was how she was able to get her hands on the matches and bring them back to her room. She remembered hiding them under her crib until night time. Everything in her life was waiting until night time. Night symbolised another dimension, a place to hide. When magic happens, the cover of night. She had always been fascinated by fire and never understood the danger of it. Fire was a destroyer, but also it gave warmth and was a cleanser. It brought transformation and cleared the way. Lighting the fire in her crib had brought outsiders into the home. It alerted others to the fact that she was there, alive, not hidden away, like her mother wanted to keep her as an afterthought. But subconsciously, Delwyn needed to break through, to let her mother know that she could be heard or discovered. She wasn't sure if she was totally on point, but she was on the right track for sure. It felt right, and the pen seemed to feel happy with what she was writing as it glowed in her hand. As she wrote, the pages cushioned the words as though satisfied with them and with what she was saying. When she finished writing, she got up and decided to move on, but then looked back at the journal, wondering if she should take it. Then words appeared on the page. "You will find me when you need me." She laughed out loud and clapped her hands together like a child. At least something nice was happening this time around. With that, the desk, chair, and journal disappeared. She stepped back in shock, but then smiled and turned to her left and walked on, still happy that her feet weren't sinking and her voice wasn't cotton. As she walked, she strained to see more doors, but again it was a long black hallway. How tiresome! She decided to run, and before long there was a gap in the hallway which startled her. It was an alcove with black leather couches against the walls on either side, and straight ahead was a window with a woman sitting there. The room behind the window was brilliantly white, and she was also dressed in white, which was such a relief from all the darkness. The woman called out to Delwyn, "May I help you?" She was familiar, and as Delwyn approached her, she realised that she was the woman she'd met at the moon station. Now she was dressed like a nurse, but a nurse from the 1950s, with her dark hair up in a bun and a little white cap. She was still beautiful, but had a cold expression on her face. Delwyn stood in front of her, not knowing what to ask. The woman had paperwork and files in front of her, and she was drumming her pencil on the notebook she was writing in, obviously annoyed. "Yes, how can I assist you?" she said tersely. A sudden chill went through Delwyn as the woman's voice was eerily like her mother's. She saw a name tag on the woman's lapel that said, Daphne White. "Are you Daphne?" she asked feebly.
"Yes, is that all?"
Daphne snapped. "No, actually, I have a few questions if you have the time." Delwyn felt brave, even though this wasn't her mother. She had just narrowly escaped being incinerated. Daphne placed her pencil slowly and deliberately onto the notebook in a fashion that stated, "All right, waste even more of my time." She clasped her hands together and gave Delwyn a questioning look, complete with raised eyebrows, pursed crimson lips, and a cocked head, but didn't speak. It was like Delwyn was back to being a child, when her mother would freeze her in her tracks with one of her icy stares, arms folded haughtily across her small-breasted chest, nose in the air, waiting for the opportunity to reduce her to the size of a mouse, so she would scurry away, apologizing with angry tears. "Well, could you tell me about this place? It's confusing to me with all the black hallways." Daphne rolled her eyes and sighed as though it was all too obvious. "You are in the Department of Childhood Memories." She reached into the drawer to her left and pulled out a pamphlet, handing it to Delwyn with a smug look on her face. "You'll find all you need to know here." Delwyn took the pamphlet without thanking her and opened it. There was a lot of small print about the Department of Childhood Memories, rules and regulations, clauses, principal operators, regulatory bodies, codes of conduct, and so on. Then she turned it over and saw a map of a large black maze of hallways. There were no markers to show where any doors or portals could be, or if there was a way out. She looked up at Daphne, who had a secret smirk playing on her mouth. "How do I know where the doors are, or how to get out?" Delwyn asked, exasperated. "That would be telling. It's up to you to figure it out. It's different for everyone," the woman said with a sneer. Then she slid the glass door over to signal the end of the discussion. She went back to her work as Delwyn slowly turned around and walked back to the hallway, but as she reached it, she turned and yelled out, "You don't have to be so bloody rude." Daphne ignored her, or perhaps didn't hear. Delwyn decided that the map was useless, but she folded it up and tucked it into her back pocket, just in case. She continued walking until another detour appeared to her left. She turned and saw ahead of her at the end of that hallway an ornate black door that glistened as though made out of black pearl. She ran to it, excited and hoping that whatever was beyond would not be completely terrible. There were spirals and delicate scrolls carved into the door, and she wondered if it signified whatever was behind it. She reached out and grabbed the doorknob, twisting it gently, and relieved that it wasn't made of rubber. It was cold to the touch, and as she pushed, the door made a soft swooshing noise, making her hunch her shoulders. Something told her not to race into the room or whatever space it was, in case she wanted to jump back into the hallway. As she peered around the door, she saw that it was a country setting, but it wasn't Magpie Meadows. It was another farm that she'd visited as a child, belonging to friends of her father's. The McTaggarts were a hippie couple that Delwyn had loved, as they were free and easy, the absolute opposite of her parents. Her father had worked with Michael McTaggart, and they had shared a love of fishing. Michael and his wife Lindsay had fallen in love with Delwyn when she was around 7 years of age, and they offered to take her for a weekend here and there when her father had to take her off her mother's hands due to one of her splitting headaches, and he had to work. Delwyn didn't remember that there was anything to fear in this space, so she walked right in and shut the door. When she turned around to look at it so she could remember where it was, she saw that it was a normal barn door on the other side, so she made sure that she had her bearings before she took off to explore. This was better. She went to the front door of the McTaggarts' tumble-down house, as it had a famous statue of David at the front for a doorbell. There was a sign over his penile unit that said, "Pull." You flipped the sign up and pulled on the penis that was attached to a wire which sounded the doorbell. It had been an hilarious trick for all the adults, but when she was a child she thought it was silly. She flipped up the sign and pulled it nonetheless. As always, the ding-dong rang out, but no one came. It didn't matter. She went off to look around. They had chickens that were allowed to wander here and there. They were never cooped up, and as she thought this, she started seeing them one by one here and there, pecking in the dirt, sitting in the trees. She'd always thought that they were magical, although she didn't know why. There were a couple of peacocks and peahens strutting around. They were even more magical. Delwyn was a child again, chasing the birds and laughing until she heard Lindsay call out, "Come on now, Del, leave them alone." She giggled and ran into Michael's work shed. It was where he'd kept all the statues of David. He had made them from a cast and sold the ding-dong statues at the local flea market. Delwyn had been mystified by those statues and remembered the feeling. Not sure if it had been the start of agalmatophilia, a sexual attraction to a statue or figure, she sat down on the floor and gazed up at them. She would spend ages hiding in the shed, just staring at them, transported to another dimension. She couldn't remember exactly what she'd been thinking as a child. Maybe it was the start of sexual awakening or alignment with the masculine form, but it was surreal. One of the many times she would drift off into another world. She contemplated this as she sat there. Was this the start of her drifting? Then she realized that maybe she'd always been a dreamer. She glanced over to the other side of the shed and saw the old dusty mirror. For some reason she'd always ignored it as a child, which was strange as she'd always been fascinated by mirrors. Maybe the statues distracted her. She walked over to it and thought, why not? She reached her hand in and fair enough, it went through. Should she dare? What if it went to a place that was bad, as this place had such lovely memories? She reasoned with herself that she would keep a hold of the frame, and that if it was a negative she would step right back. Not that reason had anything to do with these realms, but she wasn't thinking too clearly. She gripped the frame and pushed her head in to see her grandma's bathroom. It was the other side of her mirror, so surely she could come back through it. She stepped right in and found herself back in time, but still in adult form. It was night, and she remembered that when she was little and stayed at their house, she would get up in the middle of the night and talk to herself in the mirrors. Needless to say, it had freaked her elders out. They would put sheets and towels on the mirrors, but she would just go to another room and do it again in another mirror. Why had she blocked out those memories? It seemed so strange now that she was using a mirror to access the collective unconscious. She'd always been attracted to the idea of alternate worlds, portals and other dimensions. She knew it was a subconscious need for escape. As she walked around her grandparents' house, she remembered the recurring dream she'd had of a mountain which still haunted her to that day. She had always wanted to find her mountain. In the dream, she would wake up at her grandparents' house and go out into their garden around the side of the house, and she would see a majestic snow-capped mountain behind their shed. She could never get to that mountain because there was always something in the way, like a gate she couldn't get through, a clump of weeds or bushes, etc. She could see now that it probably represented the integrated self calling to her for a chance to escape all the shit that her family was going through, to find herself. Every time Delwyn saw a perfect snow-capped mountain, she got a chill of excitement, but she was still waiting for it. It was almost a spiritual pull, but it was a very particular type of mountain, and for some reason, ever since she could remember, it was somewhere in Sweden. She thought about going out into the garden, but became afraid of straying too far away from the hallway, so she went back into the bathroom and climbed through the mirror, lucky to find herself in the shed of statues. As she turned to take one last look at the mirror, she saw herself looking back from the other side. It was her 5-year-old self, smiling and peering up at her, chattering away. She was saying, "Hello, my name's Delwyn. Is that your house? Can I come? I'll be good, I promise." Her heart broke as she remembered that yearning, that deep desire to disappear into another world where no one could find her. She shook her head as she waved goodbye to herself, walking through the shed, choking on tears as the secret feeling came over her again. She lingered for a few more moments before she wandered back to the barn door and stepped into the black hallway. For a minute she thought she could hear Varun saying, somewhere in the distance, "Good, good." As she closed the ornate door behind her, she saw to her right the desk and chair appear, with the journal and pen on top. She wearily sat down and jotted down her notes, feeling a little sad that those happier times at the farm were now in her past. She thought about the symbolism of the birds, the chickens, possibly the female side of herself. If so, then why chase them away, especially the peacocks? Was it to do with her being flippant about her female side, or being aggressive due to her attitudes towards her mother? She pondered the reverence for the statues and the male form. On the one hand, she was mystified by male sexuality. On the other hand, she was indifferent. She thought about the mirrors and about losing herself, the escapism, her mountain, longing for otherworldliness, longing for herself. Melancholia drifted over her like a veil. She stopped writing and almost fell asleep until she heard a familiar meow. "Peter!" She looked back down the hallway and saw Peter meandering along as though he didn't have a care in the world. "Where have you been, you little bastard?" she scolded, but she couldn't stay mad at him. She rushed to him and picked him up, wondering where he'd been and what he'd seen. "If only you could speak." Peter just purred and nuzzled into her. "Now, stay with me, okay? No more wandering off." He meowed again, and it sounded like agreement, but she couldn't be sure. They went back to the right this time, wandering along the dark hallway until a small nook appeared to their left. It was a doorway, but this time no door. It was a large opening, straight onto a long, grey, concrete platform that had cages down both sides, like a kind of zoo or a museum. As they entered, and Delwyn said out loud, "Is it a zoo or a museum?" she saw a huge sign at the end that stated, "Delwyn's Zooseum." She looked down at Peter, who gave her a look that said, "You asked." They stopped at the first cage that had a table with a stuffed Humpty Dumpty doll on it. Delwyn gasped, "Hey, that's my Humpty Dumpty!" It was green with corduroy legs and a white top and a green satin ribbon around the middle. As a child, Delwyn had drawn question marks with faces inside the curves, all over the white section. A friend of her parents had wanted to get her analysed and thought it was very mystical, but they'd scoffed. She wondered if their scorn towards anything magical was what made her seek out the paranormal. As she stood there, staring at the Humpty Dumpty, she remembered getting up at midnight when she was very young and assembling her dolls and stuffed toys so she could be holding a meeting. She had a lot to discuss, and it was all so very important, until her mother came in and angrily told her to get back to bed and go to sleep. She remembered having afternoon naps and staring out of the window at the bright blue sky in a daze. It was a kind of meditative state, staring at the sky and the clouds, hearing a plane faintly in the distance or a lawnmower. She never thought it was particularly spiritual, but remembered wondering about life, who she was, and how nice it was just to be still and quiet. Sometimes she would get up and look out the window onto the rooftops below, at the air vents and dirty alleys. She didn't remember thinking anything specifically. She'd been full of wonder and maybe making plans of what she would do when she had the freedom to get out amongst it all. Her mother had often told her that she was off with the fairies, and that sometimes when she looked at her, she seemed to be looking straight through her mother, and that maybe Delwyn was retarded. She had a glint in her eye when she'd said that word, as though she'd just hoped it hurt. Peter began circling around her ankles, as though deliberately trying to snap her out of bad memories. She smiled and bent down to rub his head. "Thanks, matey." She walked on to the next exhibit, which was a screen with a scene projected on it. She recognised the lounge room as it was the one she lived in when she was very young. Then she saw herself, only 3 years old, sitting on the couch. She was so little, her outstretched feet didn't even hit the edge of the seat. She was watching a rerun of Bewitched on the TV. Her mother was in the kitchen and her father opened the door of the bathroom as he'd finished having a shower and was naked. She looked over and saw everything. She was completely mortified and started screaming and crying, thinking that her father was disfigured. Delwyn laughed now and didn't bother to wait and watch the bit where they scolded her for being stupid. She walked on to the next cage, which was up on a rusted pedestal covered with cobwebs. In it was a wall hanging of a Scandinavian elf that Delwyn had been particularly attached to as a child. She stood rooted to the spot for a minute, remembering the feelings she'd had when she'd look at it, when she was little. She'd always thought he was real and that one day she would find him. She continued walking on with Peter at her side, looking at the various cages and exhibits with objects that held particular significance for her and her childhood. Some of them evoked strong emotions, others just a twinge. Once they were done, they came back out into the hallway and turned right when the desk appeared again. She sat and wrote down her impressions as Peter sniffed around when the familiar hissing started and Varun materialised. This time he was a pleasant shade of eggshell blue with dark blue eyes.
"So nice to see you doing what you're told for a change," he said happily, and bent down to scoop Peter in his arms. Peter nuzzled and purred as Varun stroked him gently. Delwyn looked up and shrugged. "It has to be done, I suppose." Varun hovered over her and looked over her shoulder.
"Very good, but there's so much more to cover. You've merely scratched the surface." She stood up impatiently now. "Well, I'm sorry, but a lot of this is not an issue for me. It's nice to revisit some of this stuff, but I might as well go back to the start and live my life all over again." She half expected Varun to lose his temper over this statement, but he continued petting Peter and said calmly,
True. I know perfectly well what you mean. Let's get to the meat of it then, shall we?"
He let Peter down and snapped his fingers, and they were suddenly whisked away to a familiar stretch of road in Delwyn's past. It was again night time, and they were watching 12-year-old Delwyn running down from the phone booth near the shops, 2 streets away from her mother's house. She remembered this night and turned back to Varun, who glanced at her in triumph.
"Is this a big enough issue for you, my dear?"
he said sarcastically, the hissing getting louder as heavy rain started pouring down. Without warning, she was teleported into the 12-year-old version of herself. She felt the panic and anger pulsing through her veins. Her mother had taunted and teased her yet again, but this time it had reached fever pitch and the preteen Delwyn had lost it. Her mother's sneering words were still ringing in her ears. "God, you stink, Delwyn. Do you have your period? Learn how to wash, girl. No man will want anything to do with a smelly, chubby girl like you." She'd said it in front of the dinner guests, who were also drunk and jeering along with her mother as though they were cut from the same cloth. "Pooh, how horrible! How can you stand having her in your house, Nancy?" She ran into the phone booth, hot tears stinging her cheeks as she called her father. The phone rang 4 times before her stepmother answered it. "Yes, hello." She was also a mean-spirited woman, but not as cold as Delwyn's mother. "I need to speak to Dad," she blurted in a gust of angry tears. Her stepmother, Alice, groaned and said, "What now?" "Please," Delwyn begged, her throat aching and choking with pain and sorrow, as she already knew the outcome. As her stepmother went to get her father, Delwyn could see Varun and Peter through the window of the phone booth on the other side of the road, magically protected from the downpour, watching her intently. She realised that she wasn't there beside them since she was reliving this awful moment. Her father picked up the receiver and gave out a long sigh. "What's wrong, Delwyn?" She burst into further tears and sobbed out the story of what had happened, finishing with, "Please come and get me. I want to come and live with you." She could almost see him roll his eyes as the excuses started coming out thick and fast.
"You know I have a new family now. It's not possible."
Then came the final nail in the coffin, setting Delwyn's heart to stone.
"Remember, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger."
He went on about how her mother was inadvertently teaching her how not to be, and how one day she would escape and have a happier life. She dropped the receiver and slowly pushed the door of the phone booth open, walking into the rain, not caring that she was getting drenched. All of a sudden she was next to Varun again, watching her 12-year-old self, dragging her steps back home to the abuse. Delwyn started sobbing uncontrollably, and in a flash they were back in the hallway, and she collapsed in the chair at the desk. Varun said gravely,
"Right, Delwyn, you must get it all out."
She looked up at him for a moment. He was now grey with purple eyes, but saddened and bending over her. She couldn't help but fly into a rage. "You bastard! I hate you! I hate you!" She pummeled and punched, but he kept disappearing and reappearing here and there, zipping around and dodging her blows, saying,
"Calm yourself! Come on now! Stop this nonsense!"
After a while she fell back into the chair and wept for a few minutes more, but refused to write anything down. She yelled, "It's all in my fucking head!" Varun scooped Peter up and waited patiently for Delwyn to collect herself.
"All right, I think you've had enough for this visit. You've put a lot of hard work in, so maybe I'll let you play next time. For a little while, anyway."
She gave him a tiny smile. "Really?"
"Maybe. Now, time for you both to leave. Your aunt will wake soon."
They were teleported back to the mirror, and Varun vanished as soon as she turned to thank him. The kaleidoscope effect started up, and she didn't want to stay for that. Peter had already jumped through, so she followed and found that it had started raining at Magpie Meadows too. They ran out of the flat and back to the house. As they closed the front door behind them, she heard Gwen call out, "Is that you, Del?" She looked down at Peter and he twitched his whiskers. "Yes, coming." She went in to see her aunt and was surprised that Varun had been right about her waking up.